Welcome to Ideas in Action, a television series about ideas and their consequences. I'm Jim Glassman. A world without American automakers seemed inconceivable until November 2008, when executives from Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors told Congress their companies were near collapse. Only Ford avoided a federal bailout. Chrysler and General Motors borrowed billions from the government, declared bankruptcy, and reorganized under Chapter 11. Now, 2010 forecasts signal a rebound for the industry. Did the bailout work? And where do U.S. automakers go from here? Joining me to discuss this topic are Paul Ingrassia, former Detroit bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book, Crash Course, recounts the decline of the American auto industry. Tammy Darvish, vice president of Dar Cars, a family business with 25 dealerships representing 15 auto brands in the Mid-Atlantic and Florida. She's also on the board of the National Automobile Dealers Association. And Anthony Yeaser, director of the Center for Economic Research at George Washington University. He has consulted with Chrysler, Ford, and GM about credit issues. The topic this week, American automakers after the bailout, an industry on the rebound? This is Ideas in Action.
Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com.
In 2008, chaos in the credit markets nearly brought down the most iconic auto brands in America. Slow sales, decades of mismanagement, and high labor costs led Chrysler, Ford, and GM to the edge of bankruptcy. The government was forced to decide, let American automakers fail and lose millions of jobs, or offer bridge loans to keep the companies afloat. Ultimately, Ford stood on its own, but Chrysler and GM declared bankruptcy and accepted almost $100 billion in loans from the American taxpayer. Forced to reorganize, they hammered out new union contracts, closed thousands of dealerships, and accepted unprecedented government involvement in the management of their business. By the beginning of the year, the U.S. found itself with what seemed like a new, leaner automobile industry. Ford's $2.1 billion first quarter profit was the highest since 2004, and Chrysler and GM are reporting strong sales as well. Is the American auto industry on the rebound? Paul, let's start with you. How did the auto industry get into such trouble?
Well, Jim, it's really pretty simple. For decades in this country, there was a combination of a corporate oligopoly, known as the Big Three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, along with a labor monopoly, known as the United Auto Workers Union. So this combination of a corporate oligopoly and labor monopoly produced enormous profits for decades. But then when competition came into the market in the 1970s and 1980s, from German, but then especially Japanese cars, the oligopoly and monopoly were broken.
Tammy, how did the bailout affect you?
Well, as an industry, it affected us because they just arbitrarily shut down 2,400 dealerships across the country that are 100% independent from the manufacturer.
Including some of yours?
Yes, including some of ours. And with that, you know, you have a lot of job layoffs, you have a lot of income that our communities are normally accustomed to receiving, whether it's through taxes or payroll benefits or health benefits, et cetera, that were eliminated virtually from it. Lower dealers, lower sales.
You know, I could never understand that. Why would a manufacturer reduce the number of outlets for his product?
Well, the manufacturer was really given what I call a hall pass through the 363 bankruptcy, where there's a very small clause in it where they say that they're excused from executory contracts, like maybe a lease you may have on a fax machine. And the task force looked at the automobile dealers as being an executory contract.
Honey, you were in favor of shutting down some dealerships.
I don't like to take a position as an economist. I can tell you that if I'm advising someone where national sales are going from, 16 to 10, you're going to need less retail operations. Exactly. Also, some of the retail network, remember, was developed many years ago, before we had even superhighways. And there were a lot of very, very small dealerships whose markets had moved on. We need larger dealerships like yours that are really efficient and well run.
Well, okay, let's move on. Maybe we'll come back to the dealerships
Can
later.
I just raise one quick point about
sure.
that? I can really sympathize, if you will, with Tammy and other dealers who have lost their dealerships, or some of their dealerships. But look, bankruptcy is an ugly, painful process. That's why it's a last resort. So if dealers get restored, why don't workers who lost their jobs get restored? Why don't the bondholders who got wiped out get restored? Why don't the shareholders who got wiped out get restored? It's sort of like where you draw the line. It's a tough business.
Go ahead, Tammy.
Well, here's the difference. The difference is, and to say that whether you take a position or not, that's really boils down to, do you believe in the American Constitution or not, or the Constitution of the United States? I understand that. When we're bringing people back, we pay our own payrolls 100%. We pay for our property. We pay for our buildings. We prepay for every car before it's even left the manufacturer. We buy parts. We are the manufacturer's only customer. The market will take care of itself. Yes, I'm a big organization. I'll survive. Most people, that's all they had. Remember, there are 237 million cars on the road today, 2/3 of which are American cars. How will the domestic brand ever recover the market share they've lost?
Are you seeing that now? In other words, are American manufacturers suffering, American brands suffering because there are fewer dealerships?
Absolutely. It's simple math. And to understand that fewer dealerships mean fewer sales. But with that said, we're free enterprise. It's all about competition. These domestic manufacturers are going to have to do three things. They're going to have to restore the dealers. They're going to have to put people on their board of directors that know how, so if you're counseling them, you might want to give them some advice, how to build cars and sell cars that Americans want to buy, period. And we need a captive finance company.
I want to move to, we'll get to the captive finance company, to the manufacturers. What about these legacy union contracts? You talk about the importance of the union monopoly. Has anything changed as a result of the bailouts?
Well, the answer, I hate to be equivocal, Jim, but it's yes and no. I mean, the government did impose some strict conditions upon General Motors and Chrysler as a condition for the bailout. So basically, the multiple hundreds of job classifications were reduced, and a job classification basically said, look, if there's a machine here and it breaks down, and I'm standing next to it and I can fix it, but it's not my job assignment to fix it. We got to wait for Bill to come from the other end of the factory. But Bill's on lunch break, that sort of thing was very inefficient. A lot of that, but not all of it, has gone away at GM and Chrysler. There's also a no strike pledge, and there's also less of a burden for retiree health care that's on these companies, because now that's paid for by a union trust fund. So you have all these changes that are important changes. But the issue is, at Ford, workers rejected those similar changes by a 70% vote last fall.
So you think anything's going to happen? I mean, the grip that the unions have over the automakers, that the unions have over the automakers, is that going to continue?
Well, I think it's going to be a continuing labor disadvantage for GM, Ford, and Chrysler until the union reinvents itself.
Tammy, what would have happened if the United States taxpayer had not bailed out the auto companies?
They would have done the same thing. They would have gone through maybe bankruptcy, but they would have reorganized and they would have come back probably even more stronger than ever, because they're such a part of our economy. They can't just go away.
And Tony, isn't that right? I mean, bankruptcy. I heard one great description of bankruptcy where assets pass from weak hands to strong hands, but they tend to be the same assets. So would that have happened?
The other metaphor is creative destruction, Jim, and exactly true. Bad management should not be running major corporations.
So you don't think...
And we want to pass the assets to better managed companies. We've seen that in the airline industry. I mean, the airline industry, my goodness, I'm up there in an airplane at their mercy, and yet we seem to allow them to go through bankruptcy and survive and continue to fly.
Actually, Tammy, that brings up one of my question I wanted to ask somebody for a long time, which is, do you think, as someone who sells Toyotas, you do sell Toyotas,
Yes.
right? That the federal government had something of a conflict of interest in cracking down as it did on the accelerator problem? I mean, doesn't that raise the question of which side is the government on here?
Well, I guess I'll answer that with a question. In 2009 calendar year, GM, Ford, and Chrysler had 141 recalls. How many of those did you read about or hear about in the evening news?
What do you think, Paul, on this issue?
Well, the fact that you even had to raise the question shows one of the complications of the government getting involved in bailing out General Motors and Chrysler. That being said, though, Jim, you put yourself in the place of a policymaker a year ago, because this was all unfolding a year ago. The economy seemed to be in free fall. If you had just let General Motors and Chrysler go into a Chapter 7, which is liquidation, and then reorganization potentially, not necessarily after that, as opposed to Chapter 11, I'm not sure we'd really know where the bottom of the recession would be even today.
Why couldn't they go into Chapter 11? Not to get too technical about this.
They were in Chapter 11. They didn't go into Chapter 7, which is liquidation, but they were in reorganization, which was Chapter 11. But the debtor in possession financing was provided by the U.S. government because it was the only entity willing to do it.
But do you think that those brands would have just disappeared and that no American workers would have made American cars?
Well, I think that
we'd all be driving only Toyotas or Hondas?
Somebody would have picked up a few of those brands, but the process would have taken so long. And in the meantime, the supplier base, the component suppliers that supply not only GM but also Toyota, would have been severely weakened by losing 30-40% of their business from the Detroit companies. So this could have really spread like a wildfire contagion. The bailout was awful, but some things in life are like, they're like changing a diaper. You just got to hold your nose and do it.
Tammy, you sell American brands as well as foreign brands.
Yes.
What is the difference?
The difference for me is the DNA of the leadership of the different manufacturers that I represent. And not to be mean, but I can pick up the phone and call the president of Toyota on a Sunday evening, and if he doesn't answer his phone, I get a return call that evening. Right. If I write the CEO of Chrysler a letter, he has his attorney send my attorney a letter telling me never to talk to him again. I mean, we're their customers.
Is that the result of the bailout, or is that the way they used to do business?
No, that's not the way. Listen, it's the DNA of the company. I sat through hundreds, thousands of hours of testimony in House, Senate, and bankruptcy hearings. Chrysler repeatedly, in general, over and over and over again, stated about all we have to do is get down to 1,300 dealerships and we'll be just like Toyota. It's impossible. It's ignorant. The CEO of Chrysler at the time, who came from a tool store, could not even answer the question, how many retail outlets do you have in this country? If you don't know how many retail outlets you have, you don't deserve to be a CEO of a company that hundreds of thousands of Americans are dependent upon.
So is the culture, is the DNA changing? Is the culture changing? Of American companies, auto companies, as a result of this, of the bailout and the change in management in Chrysler and GM?
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, I currently think the ownership structure is rather problematic, and it would be very nice to get a new group in there that has, in fact, a lot of bottom line interest in running the company efficiently, and that's the problem.
And just elaborate on that. I think I cut you off last time. When you say it's problematic, you mean because government has political interests as well as money-making interests in this case?
Yes.
So there's a conflict.
Oh, exactly so. And even more so, I worry at a larger level, the government has so many regulatory interests involving the automobile companies that I wonder how they're going to be able to pursue these in any consistent fashion. I mean, we're supposed to, let's see, worry about CAFE standards, cap and trade. Oh, gee, automobile finance. Right. Okay, by the way, I absolutely agree that GM needs an automobile finance arm. Yes. Because otherwise, you only have very few mechanisms in which you can try to adjust your competitive structure and market your vehicle, and you want to be able to market the vehicles to people who are credit impaired, as well as the economists, who, as I think are the only people in our society now who are not credit impaired.
We're not credit impaired. Paul, you've written that you think that these companies, that the American companies, ought to have only one thing that they should pursue, which is profit.
Right.
And that it becomes a big problem when the government owns them.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was a problem that we got into because the economy was in free fall. But look, the goal of the new GM and the new Chrysler should not be to make, green cars or red cars or blue cars. It should be to make enough money to pay back not only the loans, but also the amount that was invested in those companies in terms of stock ownership. I mean, GM said that it paid back the loans in full, but the loans were only 10% of the money that the government provided General Motors. The rest was in stock, an equity investment, stock in GM. So they ought to pay us back and get the government, get themselves out of the business of being government owned as soon as possible. And hopefully with GM that will happen next year. We just don't know.
Do you see any changes in American car companies since the bailout?
In the management or the product or?
Let's do them both. Start with the management.
Well, I'm very concerned about on the Chrysler side as a dealer and as a leader in our industry, and I have a lot of faith in Mark Royce on the General Motors side, but I get concerned over the top leadership who call shots, make irrational decisions based on, I don't want to say ignorance, but being uneducated in the decisions that they're making.
I would also, there was a well-known survey that was done of CEOs that took over troubled companies, and they asked them, what was your biggest mistake? And the number one mistake they mentioned, I didn't fire enough people.
And that's very difficult to do when you're government owned. I mean, one headline, I guess, that the Obama administration didn't want to have is 100,000 people are fired from GM or from Chrysler. What about the product?
Well, they're going to have to put people on the board of directors that are very educated and experienced in engineering and marketing vehicles that Americans want to buy and drive. I think General Motors has the best shot at that right now.
And what about Ford? Do you sell Fords?
I do sell Fords, yes.
And is there a difference between a company that has avoided a bailout and two companies that have not?
I think Ford recognizes or has shown us that they recognize profit is one thing, and profit's very important, but in our business, without focus, and I mean hardcore focus on loyalty and retention, you can make all the money you want today, but it'll be very, very short term. We need to be more focused on those customers coming back. Just like you buy a Toyota Corolla today, you come back a couple of years, you buy a Camry. You come back in a couple of years, you may buy an ES or move up to Lexus.
So I always thought that was the great tradition for GM, was that people would own a car for 3 or 4 years, they come back and buy another Oldsmobile or whatever it was.
I don't see that now. If you look at the loyalty across the board of the manufacturers, and I'm not talking about BMW or Mercedes, Toyota is unmatched. They're in the high 60s as far as
unmatched even with the recall.
Absolutely, no question.
So people did kind of just they just shrugged and said, well, we don't believe that, or my experience with the Toyota is different, or what happens there?
I think consumers are always concerned about safety, but I think the way it was handled with Toyota, it was revolutionary in our industry because recall was always such a bad word. We never knew that our manufacturers had a recall until a customer would show up in the service department with a notice, pretty much. With Toyota, we knew it was coming. From dealer principal all the way to the technicians, and all of our management were sent to Toyota for hours of training, and we proactively contacted all of the customers ahead of time. We had completed 6,000 recall repairs before the first notice even went out from Toyota. We opened our service departments 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and our customers appreciated that.
One more point I'd mention, and that is that Ford now has a lot of debt on their balance sheet that they have to deal with.
Wasn't that kind of unfair?
I don't. I'm an economist. I haven't figured out what fair is yet.
Well, but I mean, on the one hand, you have the American taxpayer providing funds for GM and Chrysler at fairly low interest rates, and then you've got, on the other hand, you've got Ford, which has to go out in the market and borrow the money.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ford, though, could have gotten the deal if they had wanted it, and so that's why I don't want to comment on fairness, but I say they have a lot of debt on their balance sheet. This is going to be, they basically, they have to, they're running the marathon uphill both ways, okay?
So, Paul, what do you think about the Toyota recall? Has this helped American manufacturers?
Well, I think it's partly what's helping Ford right now, Jim. I do think if you go back in history a few years ago, Toyota's problems really didn't start with this recall. About a decade ago, they decided they wanted to expand very rapidly, accelerate their pace of expansion around the world, in the U.S. As well. And what they did was start building new factories at an unprecedented rate, and they emphasized quantity over quality for a while. Back in 2005, long before this sudden acceleration issue hit, Toyota actually recalled more cars in this country than it sold that year. So their quality issues have been building for a few years.
Is there any real important reason why there should continue to be American automotive brands?
Well, what is an American automotive brand? I think that Toyota actually produces more cars physically in the geographical outline of the United States than some of our own so-called domestic manufacturers. So to me, that is an American car.
So if all American brands disappeared, I mean, if the brands disappeared, that is to say the ones that are called Fords or Chryslers or
the Detroit domiciled brands, yes.
Right. Would that be a terrible tragedy?
I think it'd be a psychological tragedy. I don't think it necessarily would be an economic tragedy, frankly, because over time, those cars are still going to be built. They'll just be built by, a more effective management, as you put it. I mean, so and if the more effective management happens to be a Japanese or a Korean company or a German company, well, we're in a global economy. So I think it psychologically would be a quote, blow. Economically, I find it hard to say that it would be a blow in the long run.
The other thing is, most management is a product of our graduate schools here in the United States, and the rest of the world doesn't complain about that too much. But I mean, if you look at top management around the world, of companies around the world, we're kind of the leader in the world in educating people. So it's not as if we're talking about a management will be insensitive to the United States. And the other thing is, we have all kinds of industries who just aren't here at all anymore. I mean, we're simply talking about some quote-unquote American brands disappearing. But, when was the last cathode ray tube produced in the United States?
But do you find, Tammy, that people come into your stores and they say, I want to buy an American car?
No, I don't. And my main office is actually inside of an import dealership, a so-called import dealer, Toyota, which produces more cars here than Chrysler.
What are the new trends that we should be looking for in cars? I know there's a lot of talk about electric cars, but are there other things that we should be on the lookout for?
Sure, I'd say two or three things. I think, first of all, obviously new propulsion technologies, be it gas electric hybrids or electrics. I really personally believe that pure electric cars are going to be very slow to be adopted in this market because the infrastructure just really isn't there. But I think gas electric hybrids have a potentially bright future if gas prices go up, which means, maybe Congress should consider a gasoline tax as opposed to a corporate average fuel economy law that really doesn't incent people to change their buying behavior. The second thing is, I think consumer electronics are increasingly coming into cars in terms of high-tech electronic stuff, forward-looking radar that can keep your car a preset distance from the car ahead of you. You ought to try it on the freeway once, and if you get a little too close, it's sort of freaky because it slows you down, but it works.
Tammy, what do you see coming up?
I agree with everything he said, particularly on the technology, the gadgets. Americans love gadgets. They love technology. And if I were Mr. LaHood, I would be more concerned over that kind of stuff than some of the other things that he's so consumed with, because I'm alarmed that an aftermarket company, those are the people we really need to be careful of. It's not the manufacturers producing things that are creating so much unsafe environments for the drivers. It's the aftermarket companies who are producing accessories for vehicles that are not manufactured for those vehicles specifically. You can put a television in your dashboard. That should just not be appropriate.
Right, especially if you're driving alone.
Or you can go to a local parts retailer and buy one set of floor mats. I went to Target just to prove a point when I was down on Capitol Hill a few weeks ago, that I bought a set of floor mats and it says one size fits all. And I held it up next to the floor mat that is actually made specifically for a Toyota Camry. There's a huge difference. It's the aftermarket parts and accessory companies that really should be held accountable.
Tony, how do you see this industry developing? Just very quickly.
Well, I'll let the others comment on gadgets. I think you're probably right, but I think the big challenge is in the area of fuel efficiency. And the company that deals with that best is going to be a real winner. I think if we do have an economic recovery, gasoline prices are going up significantly.
And will that be an American company?
I don't know. I honestly, you just can't tell. But I mean, that will be the real challenge.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you.
And thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jim.
And that's it for this edition of Ideas in Action. Don't forget, you can take this show on the road, so to speak, by downloading it to your MP3 player through iTunes, or check out our website, ideasinactiontv.com. Thanks for joining us for Ideas in Action. I'm Jim Glassman.
For more information, visit us at ideasinactiontv.com. Funding for Ideas in Action is provided by Investors Business Daily. Every stock market cycle is led by America's never-ending stream of innovative new companies and inventions. Investors Business Daily helps investors find these new leaders as they emerge. More information is available at investors.com. This program is a production of Grace Creek Media and the George W. Bush Institute, which are solely responsible for its content.